Welcome back viewers, ladies, gentlemen, non-binaries and anyone with ears or other sound detection organs. Hope you enjoy. We are continuing with Going Native, written by Uncle Sealing. Going Native, Chapter 19. Before they started, Elora wanted to take one last look at Stace's left foot. If it somehow had been healing, looked better, they might not have to commit to the surgery. There wasn't really any hope of that, but it was worth investigating. It's not like she or Ian actually wanted to cut up their human. As soon as the bandages started winding back, she knew it was a terrible idea. The smell was nausea-inducing, and the heel of Stace's foot was black, with edges that had pulled back from the angry red skin around it. Pus oozed out from those edges. At that point, Elora was certain the foot had to come off, but curiosity kept her keep going. When she got to the toes, the bandage wasn't moving. Give it a tug, Ian suggested. It's probably just stuck. What else did you expect me to do? Elora gave a firm pull and the bandage came off with an odd ripping sensation. Looking at the toes revealed why, and next thing Elora knew she was heaving into a bucket. The toes were black and twisted, but the second and third toes had been stuck to the bandage. Her tug had ripped them clear, and in their place were two little stubs of yellow, decayed bone. A quick glance to the bandage showed the black remnants of the missing digits, then she was back in the bucket. When Elora finally felt emptied out, she looked up at Ian. His skin was so pale it almost looked pink and he was holding a bucket of his own, though the little man had managed to avoid actually using it. He swallowed, then let out a quiet "let's not do that again." Agreed. Elora took her bucket and dragged it into the vestibule so they wouldn't have to smell the acrid odor of her sick. While she did, she considered just how out of their depths the pair were. This was off to a bad start, and Stace's life was on the line. Thankfully, he hadn't said anything about the vomiting. He was just lying there, tense and sweating, a piece of leather clenched between his teeth. All right, you fill the syringes and I'll get the tourniquet set. Elora wrapped the strap around Stace's leg a few centimeters below the knee and set it in place, then grabbed the windlass and threaded it in. It was a cylinder made of hard plastic that could be wound tighter and tighter. Once it was tight enough to cut off blood flow, the windlass would slide into a hook on the strap, securing it so it could not unwind on its own. This was a very low-tech solution, but without it Stace would bleed out as soon as they started. Tightening the windlass was heartbreaking for Elora. This was the first time she had hurt Stace since she bruised his wrist in her first panicked moments of wakefulness. As she wound it tighter, Stace whimpered and moaned into the leather bite piece. Still, every twist was a little more insurance that he wouldn't die. Tourniquet set, Elora watched as Ian first cleaned the area with iodine, then began injecting the lidocaine /epinephrine combination along where the first cuts would be. His hands were surprisingly steady, but Elora noticed that the small male's face was only 1 or 2 steps below panic. With that done, it was time for the real work to begin. The first cut was a long curve, a deep smile carved halfway around his leg. The skin and what little fat Stace had under it split easily under the sharp scalpel, and Elora wiped away the odd red blood using a piece of cloth moistened with boiled water. The same was repeated on the underside of the leg, resulting in what would eventually turn into 2 flaps they could staple together over the end of the stump. Ian switched to a new syringe and began injecting lidocaine deeper, going directly into the meat and tissue below. At this point, Elora decided to check on Stace. His eyes were squeezed closed, but aside from that he was breathing steadily. The lidocaine had helped so far, it seemed. She reached out to ruffle his hair, then noticed the bright red blood on her hands and decided against it. Focus, Elora. Focus. Back to work. Elora rinsed off her hands, then began the difficult process of pulling the skin back up the leg. As she held it, Ian began another set of curved cuts, this time into the musculature and sinew. The goal was to make 2 flaps of muscle the same way they had made 2 flaps of skin, but farther up the leg so the skin would cover the muscle. It was at this point that the shaking started. Stace was twisting involuntarily, letting out groans of pain that only got louder as the scalpel went deeper. The human was breathing fast, but the ropes held. Finally, Ellora could see the bone. The lower leg on a human has 2 bones, a thicker one in front and a thinner behind and towards the inside of the body. Both of these had to be sawed through, and the tool for the job was a loop of serrated stainless steel wire Stace used for sawing through thin trees and animal bones. Ellora grabbed the muscle, the meat of the leg, and pushed, sliding it up along the bone and exposing more. Stace screamed. Ellora tried to ignore the sound, feeling the ache deep down as Ian looped the wire around the tibia and started pulling back and forth. He was trying to saw the bone as square as possible and as far up as he could. If they did this right, the muscle would cover the bone and the skin would cover the muscle. Ian was about halfway through the bone when the screaming stopped. A quick glance showed that Stace was barely conscious, breathing hard and shivering. As long as he was still alive, they had to keep going. Ian waited for Ellora's nod before continuing onto the fibula. This bone went a lot faster, and with a final tug of the wire Stace's lower leg fell away with a thud as the meaty weight flopped off the supporting box and hit the floor. The pair of Shilvati stopped to look at each other and catch their breath. "What's next?" Ian asked, looking at the tablet Ellora had placed on the table next to Stace. "We need to get the big arteries tied off or he'll bleed internally as soon as we pull the tourniquet." The diagrams on the tablet made it look so easy, but all Ellora could see was a raw mass of meat. "Shit, do you know where they are?" "I can't find anything in this mess." Ian was poking around the soft tissues with a finger, which elicited a long, low groan from Stace. Some water and more wiping from Ellora didn't help. The sutures were ready, those long silver clamps called hemostats were ready to go, but they just couldn't find the damn things. "I don't see them either." "They should be about here," Ellora pointed, but all that was there was more raw, red tissue. She was afraid to touch it. "Well, we have to do something. Check if Stace is awake and ask him." Ellora was dumbstruck by the suggestion. "We're in the middle of cutting off his leg and you want me to ask him for advice? First, we already cut off his leg. Second, it's either that or we sew him up and he dies anyway. I will keep looking. Ask him." Stace's eyes were still squeezed shut and Ellora could see wetness dripping from the corners. The leather bit in his mouth was soaking wet and every breath seemed to come in as a gasp and out as a moan. She rinsed her hands, then gently grabbed the bit and pulled. The human obligingly opened his mouth, then gasped, his eyes opening and meeting hers. "Is it finished?" The question was raspy, almost a whisper. "Not yet. We have the leg removed, but we can't find the arteries we need to tie off." No response. Stace's eyes just started sliding closed again. "Stace." Ellora grabbed his shoulders and shook gently. "Stace, talk to me. What do we do?" His eyes opened again and Stace was looking at her again. Weakly, he began to speak. "You're very pretty, you know that." Ellora could feel her whole body flush warm, but she knew he wasn't all there. They needed Stace, and they needed him focused. Ellora's slap wasn't particularly hard, but the sharp hiss of pain from Stace also seemed to have some accompanying clarity. "Stace. We need to tie off the arteries in your leg but we can't find them. What do we do?" After a moment, Stace had a solution. "Loosen the tourniquet. Look for the bleeding." With that, the human let his eyes slip closed again. Well, that was certainly a solution. Ellora replaced the chewed-up piece of leather into Stace's mouth and turned to Ian. "We need to loosen the tourniquet so we can see where the blood is coming from." Ian nodded. Just a second or two so we can identify it. I'll look, you take care of the tourniquet. The plastic windlass felt slick in Ella's sweaty hands as she turned it tighter, then unhooked it. She was not expecting it to spring backwards as soon as it was clear, and before Ella knew it she was fumbling and then she could hear the plastic rod skittering on the floor. Shit. Shit, 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 shit. She started glancing around the room desperately as the blood came out of Stace's leg in great spurts, soaking Ian and the floor. His own profanity echoed her own, and he tried to block the flow with his hands. Ella continued to look, her mind spinning. If she didn't solve this now, Stace was dead. Her eyes came upon the spare tourniquet, still in its packaging. Her strong fingers shredded the thin plastic wrapping and in moments she had the new strap around his leg, twisting the windlass brutally. This time, no sound from Stace accompanied the fabric strap digging in. She could hear Ian fumbling, followed by the ratcheting clicks, first one, then another hemostat closing. Ian's panic was clear in his voice, the words trembling from his mouth. Is he still alive? With the tourniquet secured, they both walked around the table to look. The human was horrifically, terrifyingly pale, nearly the same color as the screen on their pads. For a moment, the pair stood around silently, listening to the faint but obvious sounds of his breathing. Did it work? Ian nodded. I got everything clamped. Just need to stitch them closed, he let out a theatrically loud sigh. Let's never take any of Stace's advice ever again. Ella dumped water over the stump and Ian started running the suture needles, starting with the arteries and working outward. Ella's hands, now filthy with blood, held the flaps of soft tissue closed while Ian continued to work the needle and its dissolvable thread, each stitch with its own knot and completely separate from the others. It was slow going, but finally Ella was able to hold the two flaps of skin together while Ian used the medical stapler again and again, each thunk releasing a tiny stainless steel barb that squeezed the wound shut. The task was done and Ella grabbed the windlass with both hands before slowly, carefully, loosening the tourniquet. Nothing happened except for a quiet moan from an unconscious Stace. The pair of Shilvati let out a cheer and hugged each other, not caring about the blood on their clothing. Ella squeezed Ian tight and tried to catch her breath. One down, one to go. The coppery tang of blood filled the cabin, so thick he could taste it. Ian didn't think he would ever be able to purge the smell, or the sight of Stace's life spurting out onto the floor, from his mind for the rest of his life. He desperately wanted a drink. What he needed was a hug from Marion. If he was ever going to see her again, they had to finish this. They needed Stace. He needed Stace. Ella secured the tourniquet, come on, get your shit together, on Stace's right leg, just above the ankle. While she did that, Ian unwrapped the foot until he had everything exposed except the toes. He was not going to look at those things and he was not going to think about what he saw with the other foot. It didn't happen. They were out of lidocaine, but Stace didn't do more than whimper when Ian ran the scalpel through the skin over the top of his foot, perpendicular and close to the ankle. The incision continued down to the underside, where Ian turned it so that he could cut a U-shaped flap that reached forward to the arch. Once the rest of the foot was removed, this flap would be folded up to cover the front of his foot. A small part of Ian's brain wondered if touching the skin would feel like someone was touching the bottom of your foot. Would it be ticklish? He would have to ask Stace later. Focus, Ian. You're going into shock, but that's okay. You just need to finish the job first. The key to a chapart amputation, according to Ella's notes, was to essentially remove everything forward of the heel. Stace's foot would be going from 26 bones to 2, leaving only the talus, lower ankle, and calcaneus, heel, bones. Like the transtibal amputation, they would have to make sure to leave plenty of extra skin to stitch up. Unlike the transtibal amputation, This one actually went smoothly. Once Ella pulled the skin flaps back for him, it was easy for Ian to find the joints and work the scalpel down, slicing through connective tissues and cartilage until the front of Stace's right foot fell to the floor with a much quieter thunk. A few of the arteries that might be problematic were so small that they were difficult to stitch, so Ian did what he saw Stace do for Ella and burned them with the hot tip of a scalpel. Looking at the flap, Ian decided to switch to non-dissolvable thread and use stitches instead of staples. There were some funny angles and it just seemed like it would hold better. After what felt like dozens of stitches, his hands were trembling with pain. Stace hadn't made a sound, but according to Ella he was still breathing. With trembling hands of her own, Ella removed the tourniquet and they wound meters of bandages around the two surgical sites. When they were done, Stace's legs seemed to end in white spheres of cloth, one much shorter than the other. Ian was certain, to the very depth of his heart, that he could never, ever do anything like that again. "Do you think he'll make it?" Ella asked, a very unfeminine fear in her voice. Ian barely managed to smile. "He'd better, or I'll kick his ass." 2 weeks was a very long time when you are trapped in the wilderness on an alien planet. Even more so when it is cold enough to kill you when you leave the cozy cabin, even through 4 layers of clothing. What made it the slowest, though, was caring for Stace. Ian never wanted to do something like that surgery again. Cutting into a friend, using the same experience dressing the caribou on a sentient creature who could feel it, listening to him scream in pain while biting down on a piece of leather, it took at least a decade off Ian's life. Truth was, they had nearly killed Stace. The pair had started with the larger of the operations, removing his left leg halfway below the knee. The toes and heel of that foot had both been horribly frostbitten, so much so that when they unwrapped it for one last look 2 of the toes came off with the bandages. The sight of that nearly made them give up and had Ella retching in a bucket. Once they started, however, she held it together. Stace was a trooper, trying not to move, but even with the leader cane his pain was horrifying. The poor guy actually passed out from pain when they used Stace's wire saw to get through the bones, though he was back to a low moaning almost immediately after. The problem had come when they tried to tie off the major arteries. Ian and Ella couldn't find them. Even after rinsing the area, the problematic little tubes couldn't be found. Stace ended up being consulted for advice, and his guidance almost resulted in his death. Stace's solution was to loosen the windlass on the tourniquet and let the arteries bleed a little for identification. While Ian couldn't really blame Ella, she was the one who loosened it and the windlass slipped out of her sweat-slicked hands. The human's life began quite literally pumping out onto both Ian and the floor. At that point, Ian was truly panicking and didn't know what to do. If Ella had been the one to mess up, she was also the one to recover the situation. She was quick to realize that finding where the windlass had dropped in the poor light of the fire during a crisis was going to be a losing proposition and switched to the second tourniquet, managing to get it set and tightened before Stace had lost all of his blood. At least they had no trouble finding the arteries after that. The second operation was significantly easier, though the pair's confidence had been shot. Stace's right foot had severe damage starting at the toes and going back a few centimeters, but the area around the heel was still a pale white instead of the horrible purple-black of frostbite and gangrene. Ian had no idea who Chapart was, but his style of amputation was Ella's choice primarily because Stace's life would be a whole lot easier if he at least had something to walk on. After the insanity of the transtibile on the left leg, doing something so much smaller scale had a definite appeal as well. The end result wasn't pretty, with Stace's leg ending in just a heel with no actual foot, but it would be functional in the same way a table leg was functional. Of course, the surgery was only step 1. Stace had lost so much blood that he was in and out of consciousness for the next few days and couldn't keep control of his body temperature. They resorted to keeping one Shilvati in the bed with him at all times. It was frustrating, lying in that bed fully awake while a sick friend shivered against you, saying strange things in his sleep in that bizarre human language he used. Whenever Stace woke up, they stuffed him full of food, and eventually his color started to improve. He was pale, weak, and in a lot of pain, sleeping most of the day. He also didn't seem to be really aware of what was going on. But he was alive. Ellora had been having a wonderful dream. It was a sex dream, a mix of memories of parties with her pod and intense fantasies spurned on by copious amounts of porn. It felt so real, and with the stress lately and the warmth of the bed, she didn't want to wake up. She felt like she could just lay there enjoying the fantasy forever. Then she heard a giggle that brought her out of the dream. Stace had been running a slight fever the last 2 days, but apparently he was feeling better. He was spooning Ellora from behind, his left arm draped over her. It low and the hand rubbed gently between her legs through the thin fabric of her underwear. His hips were grinding against hers and she could feel something hard there, nestled between her cheeks. Now Ellora was fully awake, and she wasn't sure what to do. Stace was being awfully forward, but before the surgery she had flirted with him constantly. At least he was making a move. Then he mumbled something and Ellora heard the giggling again. "Ieng," she whispered, quietly as she could. "Yes," he replied from Stace's other side in the same low tone, "innocent as you please." "He's still asleep, isn't he?" "Yep." "What do I do?" It felt good, but Ellora didn't want to take advantage of the poor guy. Plus, did she really want her first time with a guy to be while he was unconscious? But it did feel nice, and Stace was the one doing all the work. The idea of just letting him keep going was incredibly tempting. The mischief in Ieng's voice was so thick Ellora could almost smell it. "Well, when he was doing it to me I just rolled him over so he was pointed at you." The bed was empty when Stace woke up. He had vague memories of Ieng and Ellora sharing the bed with him, but who knows when that was. He tried to sit up and take a look around, but he couldn't quite manage it. Turning his head, the 2 aliens came into focus. Ieng was at the fire, cooking something that smelled fantastic, and Ellora was sitting at the table, writing something in one of the tablets. "Hey Ellora," he croaked. "Mind untying me?" The noise seemed to startle the 2 of them, and Ieng said something that made Ellora flush a dark blue. "You're, not tied down?" Stace tried to sit up again, but still couldn't manage it. He just didn't seem to be able to get his muscles to work right. He struggled to hold up an arm and look at it, but couldn't recognize the thin, pale limb. Stace thought he could even see a slight dip in the forearm between the radius and ulna. What had happened to him? "Ellora." "What is it, Stace?" She sounded concerned, and the question was followed by the scrape of the chair as she stood to join him. "Am I dead? I seem to have turned into a skeleton." She laughed, and the sound was the most beautiful music Stace had heard in a long time. In that one laugh he heard fear breaking into mirth, and knew that whatever had happened to him, he had survived it. The worst was over. "Hello Ieng, it's nice to meet you." The small man froze, then slowly turned to look at the source of the sound. Stace was grinning at him from where he sat in the bed, folded blankets behind him to prop the pale, thin human up. He was holding one of the tablets in his lap and Ellora had a matching grin. "If you tell me he speaks shill now, I'm going to throw this frying pan at you." Stace pointed at himself. "My name is Stace. I want to touch your butt." Ieng felt his eyes widen and his jaw drop as his brain locked up. His whole face turned a deep blue and he could feel his ears burning all the way to their pointed tips. Then Ellora started laughing uproariously, shaking in her seat. Stace turned to glare at her, then said something in his human tongue. She gasped something back, and soon he was laughing too. Ian couldn't help but join in. After what felt like an hour but was likely no more than a few minutes, Ella's laughter faded enough for her to explain. I've been working on a phrase book for Stace. I wrote down every expression I could think of that he might need, then a pronunciation guide and a translation. It's not much, but it's a start. And what did he think he just said? That he was a human from Earth. I told him it was customary to say your species and home world when introducing yourself. You are going to correct him, right? Yeah, no worries. I was just having a little fun. Ian could see Stace smirking as he made some notations on the pad. If it makes you feel any better, he thought it was hilarious. Touch. Stace said. Ella said something back to him, and he made another quick note. But. Of course that's what he wanted to know how to say. Oh, this is going to be infuriating. Still, Ian couldn't help but smile. Thank you. The pronunciation was terrible, but hearing Stace praise her in her native tongue was immensely gratifying for Ella. She was no teacher, but she had learned 2 different Earth languages over the years and was passable in a third. Hopefully she could use that experience to her advantage. I try speak Shil only. That wasn't in the list. Ella looked at the pad she had handed him. He had drawn vertical lines breaking up likely parts of speech, verbs, nouns, and the like. She hadn't even considered doing that. Much of it wasn't quite right, but considering the number of phrases she had come up with during the last week or so, somebody smart could make some educated guesses. Stace was definitely smart. Stace, how many languages do you speak? He listened intently to the shill, repeated it to himself, wrote it out phonetically, then started scrolling through his list and making connections. Speak 1, can read 2. Latin? She had no idea what a Latin was, but presumably it was another language. This is amazing. Ian approached the pair holding 2 steaming bowls. Stace repeated it, wrote it out, started scrolling. After a nod, he smiled back at Ian and started writing again, scrolling back and forth as he put a sentence together. Ella noticed idly that Stace seemed to be doing everything with his left hand except for the actual writing with the stylus. Thank you. Not call me but behind back. Stace had a frozen half grin on his face until the pair pieced together his comment, which turned into a nuclear smile when he saw that the joke had landed. Stace sat the pad down and grabbed a bowl with his left hand. It wobbled, but he managed to set it on his lap. Then he tried to use a spoon with his right and the human's entire demeanor seemed to crumble. His whole arm was spasming with just the added weight of a full spoon. Stace lifted the empty spoon. A little wobble, but manageable. Add some food and the spoon started shaking until he dropped it on his lap. Ian grabbed a rag and started wiping the spilled food off of Stace, but he didn't seem to notice. Instead he turned his head to look at his chest. The human was noticing what Ella had seen a week ago, once the swelling was down and the purple of his bruising had faded somewhat. What was once a smooth chest had an oddly lumpy, swollen appearance. He moved his arm and the lump seemed to writhe and twist under his skin, a section of muscle that had become detached from its moorings and was clenching in place instead of helping move his arm. He palpated the area with the fingers of his left hand, no doubt trying to discern the extent of the injury. Ella had already gone over this with Ian, had searched the medical texts they had. Stace had managed to tear most of the way through the muscle and, while it had begun to heal, it hadn't reattached properly. Without surgery, he wouldn't have full motion or much strength in that arm. Not that he had a lot of strength in any case. Their poor human looked like one of those posters they put up in juvenile schools to scare young boys away from developing an eating disorder. Stace had finished his self-exam and picked up the pad again, doing some scrolling before carefully choosing his next statement. Well, shit. Things were going to be very different for Stace from now on. He was just going to have to come to terms with that. He had been kind of banking on being dead and had pushed his body past the safe limits. Only his two Shilvati companions had managed to pull him back from the brink, and now Stace was going to have to deal with the consequences of his actions. Consequences that included a missing foot on one side, a missing chunk of leg on the other, and apparently a detached pectoral. At least it wasn't a complete loss. He could still move the arm, which meant he could build up strength in what muscle was still connected. He wouldn't be throwing a tight spiral anytime soon, but hopefully he could get moderate use out of it. Plus it could be fixed when they made it back to civilization. Not if. When. Stace was alive, and he intended now to make sure all three of them stayed that way. Even if he was stuck in this bed for a while, there had to be a way for him to help. Elora had put him on the right path with her language guide, and even if it was a completely different system than what he was used to, it was easier than his organic chemistry class had been. He also needed to recover his strength. Even if he couldn't walk, Stace could still be useful as long as he wasn't a total invalid. Now he just needed to convey it to the Shilvati. The limit of only speaking their language was self-imposed, but immersion was the quickest way to learn. If it was an emergency, he could always switch back. Stace started to flip through the list of expressions on his pad. No word for exercise. Oh well, there were always workarounds. Elora. She turned quickly from where she sat at the table. The large woman had been trying her hand at woodworking, though for the life of him Stace couldn't make heads or tails over what she was working on. I need work, arms. He started making flexing motions with one arm. She nodded in understanding. You still need rest. We will go slow. Understandable. As long as they had enough food and supplies for the moment, better to take their time. Still, it was frustrating. What could he do now to help? Is water? Shit, what's the word? Hard. Stace pointed out towards the outside, and thus the river. Elora got a concerned look her face. It's still winter, Stace. Still cold. A minute to decipher that one. No. He made a wavy motion with his arm, then pointed outside again. The water. Oh, the river. Stace wrote down the pronunciation, then repeated it quietly to himself. Yes, it's frozen. Stace stashed the stylus back into the tablet, hiding the note function and bringing back the document reader, then started flipping through documents. It had to be around here somewhere. Found it. He slid the reader towards Elora so she could see the designs for some fish traps and drag lines. Much of it was complicated knot work, but it could be done with the same lightweight braided fishing line he had miles of. A project that would take a lot of time but could be done in part by a man trapped in a bed. After a moment of concentration, jogging his memory, Stace put together a statement that he knew would be wrong but would convey what he meant. Tapping the designs with a finger, he confidently declared, "We will have water meat." Ian was finding it very hard to keep his chuckling and grinning to a minimum. He knew it would be very disheartening for Stace to hear the young man laughing at him, but nearly everything that came out of the human's mouth was pure comedy gold. At least Stace seemed to be taking it well. Elora was out checking the snares, so Ian had Stace all to himself for at least a little while. Since Stace's little slumber time incident, the small shill had some questions for the human, but there wasn't an easy way to ask without getting Elora involved. Now, though. Hey Stace. He looked up from the knot he was trying to tie and gave Ian a smile. It had been so long since he had seen Stace healthy that Ian could feel a flutter in his chest and his skin heating up. That must be the reason. Yes, Ian. It had only been a couple of days since Ella gave Stace the phrase book she had been working on, and his pronunciation seemed to be getting better almost by the hour. When he wasn't working on the fish traps he was attempting to build, Stace was memorizing and doing assignments Ella put together. "Do you like Ella?" Stace's eyebrows furrowed. "Yes, I like her." "I mean, do you like Ella?" "Attracted?" The human caught on fast, his pale skin turning pink as he blushed. "I don't know." "Yes." "Explain attracted." He mumbled something in human talk to himself. For a moment Ian thought he was going to have to explain to this human at least a dozen years older than him the differences between boys and girls, then realized that Stace simply didn't know the word. In either case, this was going to be awkward. Pointing at himself, Ian said, "Male," then pointed at Stace and repeated it. Then he gestured towards the outside and said, "Ella is female." Stace nodded, though apparently he now had a better understanding of where the conversation was going and he was not comfortable with it. The human's eyes were downcast and there was a lot of pain in his face. Still, Ian figured that if Stace hadn't actually told him to stop, he would keep going. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was a sort of misplaced empathy, but Ian felt like he needed to know. There was an easier way to explain this, he realized. It would just make it a lot more uncomfortable. Ian stood up and made his way towards the dresser. End of chapter. If you enjoyed, like, subscribe, click the bell so you don't miss any episode and do all the other YouTube stuff. Visit and support the author, and I'll see you next time. If you didn't enjoy, comment on what I can do better. And as usual, have a wonderful day.